Java gives you a number of ways of looping through or iterating through collections of data, either ordered or unordered data. I'm going to demonstrate some of these techniques in the project Iterate Collections. I'm starting with an array list, declared at line 13, and it contains 3 items. And at line 19, I'm outputting that list using simple output, passing the object to print line, and that calls the toString method of the object. When I run the application, I get the data printed out with the standard formatting. Now, I'm going to describe how to use something called an iterator object. This used to be the most common way of looping through a collection. You create something called an iterator object, and there's an interface available for this. And notice up at the top that now I have an import statement that says java.util.*. IntelliJ IDEA has decided that I'm using so many interfaces and classes from this package that instead of importing them individually, it's just going to import the entire package. That doesn't affect performance at all. It's simply a way of reducing the amount of code. An iterator is similar to the other collection interfaces in that it takes generic notation, so you can indicate what kind of data you're looping on. I'll say I'm looping on a string, and I'll name this object simply iterator. Then I'll call the list object and its iterator method, and that returns a reference to an iterator object that I can use to loop through the list. In order to loop through the data using an iterator, you'll use 2 methods. A method that returns a Boolean called hasNext that indicates whether there's available data in the object you're looping through, and then another method named next that moves to the next available object and returns a reference to it. I'll create a while loop, and my condition will be iterator.hasNext. Then within the loop, I'll create a string that I'll name value, and then I'll call iterator.next. And then I'll output that string. So this is the code you need. You get the iterator object, then you create a loop, and within the loop you get the reference to the object, and you do whatever you need to do with it. And when you run the code, you get the output. You can also loop through an array list using a foreach statement. I'll create a for loop, and within the for loop, I'll create a string, I'll name it value, and then after a colon, I'll say I'm getting the data from my list. And within the list, I can output the value. And there's the result. It's exactly the same output, but I don't need the additional object that the iterator requires. So it's a little bit more memory efficient and takes less code. And finally, another technique was introduced that you can use for this in Java 8, called method references. I have a loop containing strings. And let's say I have a method of some object that's accepting a single string argument. I can simply say, use this method, and the compiler takes care of everything else. I'll call list.foreach. Now be warned, this method only exists in Java 8 and later. It doesn't exist in Java 7, and it doesn't exist in Android's version of Java. Next, I'll pass in a class that has a static method I want to use. I'll call system.out. Then I'll put in a pair of colons, and then the name of the method I want to call, println. Now the logic is, the println method accepts a string. I'm passing the object, and the compiler says each of the items in the list is a string, so it then calls the method for you and passes the string in. I'll run that code, and again, I see exactly the same output. In Java 8, this is unquestionably the most efficient, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of the amount of code you have to write. You can also loop through unordered data. I'm going to uncomment the rest of this code, and now I have a map containing 3 items. Each item has a key and a value. And if I run the code, I get an output of the data using the default formatting of the toString method of the list interface. But now, I'll use a hash map iterator. First, I need to get a set of keys. A set is similar to a list in that it contains ordered data, but it guarantees uniqueness, and that's not something that an array list will do. I'll create a set, And I'll set the data type of the items in the set as string, and I'll name it keys. Then I'll call the method map.keySet. The keySet method returns a set, and now I have a unique set of keys that I can use to reference the items in the map. Next, I'll create an iterator. Once again, I'll set the generic data type as string, and I'll name this one iterator1, and I'll call the method keys.iterator. Next, I'll use a while loop. My condition will be iterator1.hasNext, and then within the loop, I'll create a string. Then I'll call iterator1.next, and now I have the current key, and then I'll output the capital of, and then I'll append the key, then another literal string, and then the value with map.get, and I'll pass in the key. So using an iterator on a hash map takes a bit of code, but it absolutely works. And I see the output of the three states and their capitals. And just like an array list, you can use a foreach loop on a map. I'll use that same set of keys, and this time I'll create a for loop, and then within the parentheses, I'll create a key variable, a string, and I'll get its value from the keys collection. And within the loop, I'll output the same value. I'll just copy and paste this bit of code. And there's the result. So you have iterators, you have foreach loops, and in Java 8, you have method references. You can use any of these three coding strategies to loop through or iterate through a collection of data.